This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
For now, we turn our attention to gang violence and organised crime in the Western Cape that have been in the public discourse for several weeks. We've been talking about it every other day. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, they've released their latest Western Cape Gang Monitor. This reveals how AK-47s were smuggled among fruit trucks that are making it into the hands of criminals. It also revealed how turf wars are tearing through Hanover Park. This morning, we'll unpack the collapse of extortion empires in Khayelitsha that has triggered new waves of bloodshed. We're now joined by an associate of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, Brandon Davis. Brandon, good morning and welcome to Radio 786.
Good morning, Josh Rick. Thank you for having me today, and good morning to all your listeners.
Lovely to have you. What are the standouts, the sort of summary talking points that the report so does reveal?
So the main points that we publish in this issue of the Gang Monitor is, firstly, the issue of illegal firearms. And this especially comes from, the local domestic markets, but also from cross-border markets. And that was why we covered the issue of firearms coming from Namibia. And then, of course, we delve a bit deeper into the issue of extortion, particularly in the township areas, and the collapse of certain networks. They're either due to arrest or being killed by rival extortion groups, or engaging in shootouts with the police, resulting in loss of life. And then, of course, we also delve a bit deeper into the gang dynamics playing out in Hanover Park. We, of course, know that Hanover Park is, one of the worst affected areas in South Africa when it comes to gang violence. So we delved a bit deeper into some of the dynamics playing out there, and we've also mapped out the different gang territories.
Okay, and what do we look? I mean, the one of the main concerns is that gangsters have always been a part of our society for the longest time. There are concerns about them getting younger and the way that they're operating and how more violent they're becoming. But that violence, of course, is predicated on the availability and the proliferation of weapons, guns that are making it, onto the scene. And just yesterday we were reading about AK-47s confiscated in Bellville by the police. There was that house that we understand, belonged to the Sexy Boys gang in Mitchell's Plain, where also, again, a cache of weapons were found. But the report does highlight the issue of weapons smuggling, and you particularly focus on it from Namibia. Tell us more.
Yeah, sure thing. So the issue of illegal firearms, as we all know, is a huge problem in South Africa, particularly here in the Western Cape and on the Cape Flats. Firearms, it's very much the currency of the underworld. And what we are seeing playing out in communities, particularly on the Cape Flats, are cycles of violence that are linked to firearms and illicit markets. So when I speak about illicit markets, I'm talking about the drug trade, extortion, and those types of markets. So let's take the drug trade, for example. Gangs use guns to fight over drug turf. If they expand their territory, they're able to sell more drugs, which means they can have more money to buy more guns, which are then used to fight for more turf. And that is how the cycle goes. And another major problem is that because of this greater pool of firearms, which I'm going to get into now, there are many more altercations that wouldn't ordinarily end up in shootouts, but they are now. And if we look at the numbers of gang-related murders in the Western Cape, and this is according to SAPS, the yearly total has more than doubled since 2020. In 2020, it stood at 422. And in 2024, the last full year statistics, it was at 872. Now, granted, 2020 was a bit of an anomaly because of the lockdown and other factors, but there's no doubt there has been a year-on-year increase in gang-related murders. So we needed to look at where why were these shootings happening? And to do that, we needed to look at where these guns are coming from. And as you rightfully say, in the most recent Gang Monitor, we looked at Namibia as a source of these guns. And our sources on the ground were saying that Namibia has been one of the sources for firearms for gangs since around about 2016. And, gangs, particularly those in the Grassy Park area, and when I say Grassy Park, I mean the entire precinct. So that's Lotus River, Parkwood, and Ottery as well. The gangs there in particular, including the Junkie Funky Kids and the Six Bobs, they were often mentioned to be receiving these weapons. Now, the firearms being smuggled into the country have been arriving through, trucks belonging to companies trading in fresh goods, as you've mentioned, between South Africa and the neighboring countries. And, so they are hiding these shipments of firearms in those in those goods. And the smuggling on this route seemed to increase over time. And in 2021, there were reports of irregular shipments of firearms, dozens at the time, being received by gangs. Now, in the last month or so, 9 people appeared at the Windhoek court in Namibia, and they were charged with 16 counts of theft for stealing weapons, including AK-47s, from a military stockpile and trying to smuggle them into South Africa. And one of the accused was an employee of one of these trucking companies. So SAPS and the Namibian police, they've been investigating the smuggling of Namibian state weapons to the Western Cape since around about 2020. And this came after a cache of Namibian police pistols was seized in October of that year at the traffic stop. And this was purely by chance on Blauwberg Road. And in April last year, a man by the name of Urbanus Shambwako, he's a Namibian national, he was convicted for that case. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he was named in a statement by Arthur Fraser as being one of the individuals who broke into the president's property at Pala Pala. So he was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. But the issue here is that Shambwako, he seems to be an intermediary rather than the leader of the operations. And, in February of this year, the Western Cape Police Commissioner, Tembisile Patekile, said that, the police had seized more than 90 firearms that could be traced back to Namibia. And a Namibian police source confirmed that these 90 firearms were from Namibian police stores. And, I think we need to commend SAPS for taking those firearms off the street. But the problem is that Namibia is just one source of these illicit firearms. We've seen them coming in shipments from other countries as well, arriving at ports in other parts of South Africa. We've seen in the news how AK-47s, which appear to be Chinese-made, were found in busts at the ports. And then, of course, there's also the domestic firearms market, which is the biggest source of firearms for these gangs.
Okay. Goodness, I have so many questions. So, the weapons that coming from Namibia, that they are all suspected to be stolen weapons from Namibian state authorities, like the police, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and these guys then that transported, they of course may well be intermediaries, but as you say, there's the theft of the weapons, and then of course they get made available here. Is there any evidence to point out that some of the shootings that are happening on the Cape Flats at the moment, they're being done by means of AK-47s? Because I've always just understood them to have been pistols, handguns.
So the majority of firearms used in gang fights are as handguns. We often see that in the taxi industry. We see the use of AK-47s in some of the crimes that have been committed there. And, in the news, you see a lot of security for these taxi associations walking around with AK-47s. There were also some videos in the Joe Slovo Township that came out of the Joe Slovo Township in Milnerton of individuals firing AK-47 rounds off into the air. So it appears that it's more connected to the township areas as well as the taxi associations, whereas handguns tend to be used by the traditional Cape Flats criminal gangs.
Okay, and these weapons, they are largely all found to be stolen, and of course illegal. With certain of their serial numbers being filed off, etc., and then used locally in the committing of crime. Such as the examples that we've been then talking about. What has been, given the seizure that we now saw this week in Bellville and the one in Mitchell's Plain, etc. There's the weapons that were found in Bellville, for instance, they were claimed to be from sourced from KZN. There was also recently, weapons that came from Gauteng that were seized in a vehicle, and they were bound, of course, destined for the Western Cape. While we are beginning to see patterns emerge, like the ones that's found in the report, what, according to your knowledge, is the police's successes, or at least whether they're onto those involved in the actual syndicates? As you say, the guy that was involved in stealing of the weapons that was tried in Namibia was the same guy that was involved in the Pala Pala cash heist of the president. But these are, again, intermediaries. Do we know who's pulling the strings here?
So as far as we know, the majority of firearms that are available, of illegal firearms that are available to gangs and other criminal organizations, they are from a domestic market. Now, so for example, in November in 2023, it was discovered that 15 firearms had gone missing from SAP 13 evidence stores at the Mitchells Plain police station. In 2016, a senior police officer, Colonel Prinsloo, we all know about the major issues there. He admitted to being part of a network that operated for about 8 years and supplied more than 2,400 firearms from the police armory in Gauteng to gangs in the Western Cape. By 2016, police had recovered 900 of those firearms. So there were significant arrests that were made, but the problem is we are still seeing huge amounts of firearms available to these gangs on the street. And it has been linked to systemic corruption and dysfunctionality in the Central Firearms Registry, for example, where it would appear that gang bosses were being allowed to fraudulently acquire firearm licenses, giving them access to lethal weapons and ammunition. So while there have been significant arrests made by the police, it's clear that there are still other sources of firearms available from which these gangs have access to. And those, there needs to be more to curb the stem of the flow of firearms to these gangs.
Okay, let's deal with other bits of the report that describes Hanover Park as being one of the epicenters for gang violence. What's driving the surge in killings there? You talk about splinter gangs, or the report talks about splinter gangs, that's challenging, for instance, the traditional American gang.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So one of the major developments we've seen over the last few years, and it's something that we've really been focusing on a lot in our reports and our engagement with the state, the police, civil society, it's this thing we call gang fragmentation. So over time, we've seen these splits emerge within gangs, and it happens for many reasons. It could be gang members, being upset with the way in which the gang's being run. They feel they're being unfairly treated. There's a variety of reasons. And that can lead to the formation of a new breakaway gang. Now, as far as we know, this has always been occurring in gangs, but in the last few years, it's been happening much more frequently. So, for example, the Americans in Hanover Park, we've seen the likes of the IGBs and the Dollar Kids break away from their ranks over time. And this has been, a major source for violence in the area, with the IGBs, competing against the Americans for resources and for turf. It's also, the same thing occurred with the ghetto kids in the area, and their splinter gang, the OTFs. And there's been major fighting because of that, because of those splits. And this is confirmed by the City of Cape Town's Hotspotter report, which, we mapped out these territories and where these gangs operate. And we can see that most of the violence occurs along these borders between these splinter groups and their main gangs.
Yeah, which, of course, I wonder how much of this has got to do with in relation to prison gangs. We heard the Minister of Police, the Acting Minister of Police, Firoz Kachalia, talking about the communication that's happening between prison gangs and what we see on the ground at the moment. Is there a way to determine, whether these splinter groupings are groups that may be in some way or the other aggrieved with leadership struggles within the existing gangs? Because the police had previously told me that in Mitchells Plain and in other parts of, I think it was like Grassy Park or Lavendale, one of those areas, that, the spate in gang violence there was as a consequence of an internal battle over leadership. And this, as we particularly also look at the amount of guys that are currently being tried, for instance, in court. Then there was this terrible Justice gang leader as well that was, recently killed and found, his body was found floating in a river and suspected there to be linked to smuggling of cocaine. And so it's a little bit difficult to determine in all of the instances what we're dealing with, but there seems to be a confluence here of a claim that a lot of the gang violence that has particularly skyrocketed over the last couple of months, it is as a consequence of a leadership battle within the gangs.
So that is something that we have been seeing over time. Like I said before, there's this internal contestation, whether it's because of the disagreements of the way the gang's being run, or just a generational divide in gang members. We're seeing a lot of internal conflict, and that is leading to a lot of breakaway gangs forming, and also resulting in a lot of violence. But in other cases, with the case of the terrible justice leader, we found that we find that local gangs are working with international drug smuggling syndicates. And, in the case of the terrible justice, in our previous report, we wrote about how they were collecting cocaine off of our coastline. And they were alleged to be working with Bulgarian criminal syndicates operating in South Africa. So it's very interesting to see this dynamic evolve over time of how gangs are becoming increasingly more organized and branching out, working with international organized criminal syndicates. And that's also, it's contributing to the growth of illicit markets in South Africa, which in turn leads to more competition over these illicit markets between the different gangs, which results in more violence.
Yeah, which again, is interesting, but very, very much worrying to those that have to live with this every single day. Our WhatsApp line on fire with every other day reaction to gang violence in which communities feel that they are being held to ransom. You cited shot spotter technology. This, of course, the technology that's imported from the United States and used here in Cape Town. It is largely seen as an effort by the City of Cape Town Safety and Security Directorate. People often say it's JP's technology. How effective is it really in tracking gun violence? Do you think it's a worthy investment to determine and understand the patterns of these shootings?
It is. ShotSpotter is incredibly useful at picking up precisely when and where shootings occur. The problem is it does lack context behind these shootings. Obviously, ShotSpotter doesn't know the reason as to why these shootings are occurring. It's just an acoustic detection system. It's not more than that. But what is required is the building up of our intelligence so that we can confidently say what is happening, and that we can predict what is about to occur. So it's essential for the different government departments to come together and utilize their various strengths and build a comprehensive plan to ultimately reduce gang violence and reduce gang membership as well.
Yeah. And given the shifting dynamics that we see within gangs, the report also deals with Khayelitsha, quite interestingly, claiming that there's the removal of extortion bosses that has led to new violence. Are these vacuums of power that exist, new avenues for crime? What role does extortion-related, gang leaders have to do with the way in which, again, we're seeing shifting patterns of crime?
Yes, so the GI, we felt that the violence playing out in other township areas, it doesn't receive the same amount of attention as other areas on the Cape Flats in particular. So we delved a bit deeper into some of these areas, and what we found is that the levels of violence are extremely high in the township areas. And we see the news of mass shootings occurring almost every week, and many of these mass shootings are extortion related. We have groups trying to intimidate the community or basically enforce their dominance to, force these community members to pay extortion fees and to not testify against these groups in court should they be arrested. Now, there's been this very disturbing dynamic playing out in some of these township areas, particularly in Khayelitsha, where we see the rise of what the GI calls criminal governance. And it's essentially a criminal group exercising control over a territory or a community, almost exercising this quasi-governmental role. And extortion groupings have been at the center of this. So just to paint a bit of a picture for you about this, the state's case against Barra, his name was Yanga Nyalaga. He was once termed the Western Cape's most wanted man. It offered some insight into this issue of criminal governance. So Barra was accused of carrying out various mass shootings in May of 2021. They left 12 people dead. This was allegedly because a member of his gang was killed by a rival extortion gang while he was collecting money. So after this individual was killed, Barra's gang then allegedly went out and killed 12 people at random, just to show as a show of force to convince the community to pay them extortion fees and not the other gangs. But another point, again, just to show you how bad things have gotten in terms of criminal governance, is that Barra was alleged to have had his own police station outside of the Site C taxi rank. This was according to a police affidavit deposed on the 30th of October. And he encouraged the community to report crimes to him, and he would resolve them. He would resolve these issues for a fee. So this is the type of issues that we are dealing with in these township areas. And it's going to require a lot of intervention from the state and from civil society to actually bring positive changes to these communities, to change mindsets, to sort of denormalize extortion and criminal governance in these areas.
Yeah, I do think that this guy was, a former teacher. He was 30 years old at the time, when this matter came to court. But, it's fascinating to read these very vivid accounts of, crime and as you call it, the administration of crime. Let's deal with the police's response. Often comes into criticism. I can understand why. Some feel that they're not visible enough. Others believe there's not enough intelligence to mitigate against this type of crimes. Others cite the lack of investigative work to be able to bring cases to court that is worthy of prosecution. And what from the successive reports, including this one that have been now put together, by your organization, the Global Initiative Against, Transnational Organized Crime. What are you learning from the police's effectiveness in dealing with it?
Well, what we are picking up is that what's this common theme of the police being reactive to crime. They are not. There needs to be more proactive investigations and the intelligence building to actually make these arrests and prevent crime from happening in the first place. But having said that, we know policing itself isn't always, or the prevention of crime isn't always up to the police in particular, although they do play a major role in that. So, as we've been picking up on these issues of policing in certain communities, we've come up with a few recommendations, and that is, number one, to create an oversight mechanism tailored exclusively to monitoring police progress in addressing gang violence in the Western Cape. So this oversight body needs to be made up of different government agencies, including SAPS, the Department of Social Development, the NPA, and provincial government as well. And in addition to that, there needs to be a panel made up of members of civil society, the private sector, and academia, and the affected communities that can provide input on a public plan and independent monitoring of the police progress in addressing gang violence. So in other words, the accountability and counter-corruption actions need to be improved.
Yeah.
Then there needs to be a comprehensive strategy for gang violence prevention as well. So there needs to be civil society support networks in gang-affected communities that work comprehensively to build resilience to gang culture. There needs to, we need to increase security measures in and around court buildings to prevent the killing of witnesses and those testifying in court for gang cases. There's so much that needs to be done, but I'm entirely convinced that, should politics be put aside for effective policing and actual measures to reduce gang violence, it is possible.
And you cite, or the report cites as part of that, outdated statistics on gang numbers that's still widely quoted. Why do you suppose this is problematic, and what alternatives would there be to measure gang activity?
So, that's another thing that we've been picking up on, is that gang statistics have been reused over the years. And so the statistic was that the Western Cape has between 90 and 130 gangs with a total membership of about 100,000 people. Now, these stats were first made available in the year 2000. And since May of this year, at least 3 media reports from the South African media outlets have quoted this statistic. Now, the problem is is that these statistics, they have the potential to misinform policies and interventions aimed at addressing gang-related issues. And, that's why we have continuous publications such as the Gang Monitor. It's exactly to stay on top of gang dynamics and, the illicit markets that they're involved in, so that we can, put out accurate information so that comprehensive strategies and interventions can be put in place. And, counting the number of gangs in South Africa is a major task, but there are some, alternatives to working this out. And that is, to use, number one, the gang-related murder statistics that are published by the South African Police Service every quarter, and to make use of technology such as ShotSpotter, and to use other measures, including, for example, gang-related, firearm-related robberies, drug arrests, to help paint a picture of the scale of gangsterism in South Africa. And we know that no estimate will ever be perfect due to the challenges, like I mentioned. But from the perspective of policymakers, it's important to know the overall size of the phenomenon as best as possible to help mobilize resources and to ultimately shape responses.
And lastly, I don't want to lose sight of this, but the report also touching on the role of the taxi industry in organised crime. Of course, naturally, one can look at the extortion networks that exist and how taxi associations are intertwined. There's also a series of recent times, a series of shootings and killings that have happened, and this largely we understand to be over routes. But what role, other than the very thuggish behaviour that we see on the road sometimes, what did the report find in regards to the role of the taxi industry?
So, in recent times, we've been seeing increasing fighting between the taxi associations, but also between taxi associations and gang members. In the Vryheid area, for example, we saw a lot of shootings happening, and that was allegedly conflict between the taxi association and gangs. But as it's mentioned in the report, the taxi association and extortion, there seems to be this link between the two. And remember, there's also extortion happening within the taxi industry as well, where, there's the system of money being siphoned from those lower down in the system. And like I mentioned before, we've seen in our research how AK-47s and are making their way to those involved in the taxi industry, and hitmen linked to the taxi industry in particular. And I think the term for that is the inzikabi. And, there's a strong correlation between township extortionists and the minibus taxi industry.
Yeah, which, does make this issue of policing a little bit more complicated when it shouldn't be, but it is. And so thank you very much for the great work that you guys are doing to give us the information and intelligence on gang-related activity. It's an important report. This is the Western Cape Gang Monitor. It comes out regularly, and it's the work of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. And Brandon Davis, who's an associate there, joined us there on the line.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.